Andreas Dirnagl, Senior Advisor Healthcare of DNB in New York. Thank you so much for taking the time to also be on a panel. And Claus, Henrik Johansen, you are the founder and CEO of the Global Health Invest Fund. And you have actually stayed on since yesterday, which is also
exactly, yes.
Very nice of you. Thank you very much. This panel then is titled Global Trends in Healthcare, such a huge topic, I would say. But I would actually like to start by reconnecting to what you were talking about earlier today, Andreas, in your keynote speech about the impact of the US election results. I think you gave a very actually hopeful picture of the whole thing. Depending on which side you're on politically, of course, but for me personally, I felt a little bit more hope after I heard you speak. But seeing as you both are quite well connected in the pharma world, you know a lot of pharma CEOs and so on, I would like to hear, can you sort of give any insights on what kind of reactions you have had from pharma leaders after the election? If we start with you, Andreas.
So I'd say it kind of runs the gamut of the reactions you're getting from almost anyone. You know, there's the personal viewpoint and then there's the business viewpoint. And so whether or not those two mix is one thing. But, you know, what I would say is sort of how I ended my presentation, which is, you know, the US, the global healthcare system is an oil tanker that you cannot move on a dime, and no one can move it on a dime. And I think, you know, if anyone understands that, it's the CEOs of the pharmaceutical companies. So I think they are doing what they have been doing for the past number of years, which is positioning themselves in such a way to be reactive to and understanding of governments and politics in terms of things like reimbursement pricing, methodologies, value-based pricing, et cetera, et cetera. They have become, I think, more active about that, which is a good thing. And I think they are taking advantage of some of the positive PR that they got out of the pandemic, if I can put it in those terms. I think certainly post-pandemic versus pre-pandemic, the general population views pharmaceutical companies much differently than they did before, and I think they're going to try and continue to take advantage of that. I don't think there's anyone that's necessarily panicking at this point.
No. Moving slowly, I mean, maybe it takes an oil tanker to recognize an oil tanker. So Claus, what are your reflections as a long-term investor as well? What do you think? What have you heard in terms of reactions?
To be frank, I haven't heard that much really significant. I think we've seen over the last couple of years that there has been a lot of pharmaceutical companies also from the European side actually investing into the US. So investing in factories and so on, because it's really important for them to be in US on the ground, because it's also easier to negotiate because there's jobs involved. So it's not only, let's say, to go after the, let's say, the weak European companies, because they're actually employers and large employers in certain states in US. So that's really important to watch. Mm. And we saw, for instance, AstraZeneca recently announced a huge capex plan just after the election. So I think that's worth to pay attention to.
Mm. And policy shifts happen, I mean, from time to time. So how do you in general prepare for the potential impact of policy shifts and political alternations when you focus on long-term healthcare investments like you do in your fund?
You always have to think about what, of course, is policy and what is politics. Because it is an oil tanker. It's really hard to make really big changes. So it will be smaller changes, but we all know also that the financial markets are looking at headlines. So they are shooting first and ask the questions later. So you have to prepare for that. So that has been part of my strategy to look into what could be the upcoming debate on certain, let's say, healthcare reform. Trump has not been really discussing healthcare during his campaign. But if we, let's say, roll back the movie 8 years back and see, okay, what was actually on the agenda back then? And what could, let's say, reappear on the surface? And what could be the impact of the risk premium on certain stocks? I don't think in my portfolio, I don't see that much earnings estimate risk per se, but there is this increased risk premium, so we have to take that into account.
I think Claus makes an interesting point in I love the distinction between politics versus policy, right? And that's where I think it often that line blurs a little too much, whether you're coming from an investor perspective or whether you're coming from a company's perspective. And, you know, as Claus said, rolling back the movie to 8 years ago, there really wasn't, besides the attempt at repealing Obamacare, which really had less, in my opinion, to do about the concept behind Obamacare than it did to basically try and prove that I'm going to reject anything that my predecessor did. You know, that distinction is then important to make. And so there are going to be aspects of the Trump administration, especially in the early days, that could potentially touch on some very esoteric sort of reimbursement things. We were discussing some of them earlier today. You know, that is going to be, in some cases, very company-specific, very drug-specific, very service-specific. I don't see, and I agree with Claus, I don't see anything that is really going to change that dramatically from a broad industry perspective.
So as an advisor, then you don't have to give any specific advice regarding to this, or it's just, you know, sit down in the boat and take it easy?
Again, I'd say my first piece of advice that I have given quite a bit over the past couple of weeks is take a breath, right? Just take a moment, let the sort of what is for many people, if I can say even most people, the shock of the result of the US election. It certainly was in the US, I think. Take that into account, take a breath, and then continue. I wouldn't say refocus, I'd say continue to focus.
And you also mentioned in your keynote that, I mean, obviously this has come with some insecurities and some volatility. Remember back then, the last time Trump was president, it was quite volatile, and you could actually use his Twitter feed as sort of investment triggers, I think. Is that something you see as an investor then as possible opportunities in this?
I'm not using Twitter as a, let's say, a signal to buy or to sell, really. I'm watching what is actually being, let's say, announced. And of course, we have to see what RFK Jr. will, if he is being, let's say, approved, what will it be his first, let's say, initiatives. So I'm looking for, let's say, the facts. What could be the real policy changes? There will be a lot of headlines. We'll know that. And that can, in today's world, we can see that headline trading, it happens a lot. So we have to look out for that. So that can actually create a lot of volatility and also increase the risk premium on certain stocks right now. But fundamentally, you have to look into the US as, of course, they're paying more attention to what they're paying. So you have to look for how drugs are being priced in that market as well. You cannot just price it very high. We've seen some companies made that mistake over the last 5, 6, 7 years. So they had to reduce the price in order to really gain market access. So I think you have to, just coming back, what is the best advice? That is really to look into really providing value to the payers and to the patients if you go into the US market.
And well, with a very pronounced America First attitude, do you think that stance will affect cross-border collaborations and investments between the US and Europe or the Nordics even? What do you think, Andreas?
From a healthcare perspective, I'd say immediately no, right? Now, you know, caveating that, as you call it, the increase in the risk premium, whether you want to call it, as I said in my presentation, just acknowledge the fact that things are more uncertain and they are going to be more volatile going forward. That is certainly going to have an impact. So it's a question as to whether non-US companies are going to be willing to go into that volatility. Now, at the same time, it's the largest single healthcare market in the world. And I certainly don't shy away from saying controversial things at times, so I'll do it right now. The other realization that has to be made, especially in a room like this, is that every single person in the room here that is not a US citizen benefits from US drug pricing. right? The only reason that European drug prices are where the governments mandate them, and the only reason that the drugs are being sold, and I'm being very a bit sarcastic here, but is because drug prices are so high in the US. So in many ways, bringing down US drug prices is not a great thing from a European perspective, because it probably will result in the requirement for drug prices here to go up.
And with the long-term trends that you were alluding to in your presentation yesterday, with aging population and obesity, pandemic, and so on, what could be the implications of what Andreas just said then, in the long run for European companies?
I think there's tremendous opportunity going to the US. So if you have great molecules, good data, great data, you can go to the US market for sure. But you need to be prepared. You really need to think about, in terms of what kind of relationship do you have on the market, let's say on the ground level, which KOLs do you have good contact? Have you established a good contact with? It's hugely important, because that will open up the market opportunity. So you need to, let's say, really prepare if you are, let's say, going to get a beachhead in the US market. So I'll definitely talk to Andreas, get some good advice, because it's a tough market. I mean, capital is really available in the US, but you also need to be prepared, and you need to have good data. If you have good data, capital will be there.
Be prepared and be careful.
Yes.
Right. That the other piece of advice that I often give, particularly when I'm here in the Nordics or in Europe, is there is a understandable desire to go to the U.S. market, whether that is for your product or whether that is to raise capital. I get it. Be careful what you wish for in many ways, right? It is a radically different investor community and a radically different market than you have here in Europe. And I think personally there is a huge amount of validity in sort of moving perhaps more gradually, right? If you are a Nordic-based company, you start in the Nordics. As you move past the Nordics, and let's be clear, First North aside currently, I mean, there's an established healthcare infrastructure here in Sweden. There's a very well-established healthcare infrastructure in Denmark. There are areas that you can go for capital there. Then there are very sophisticated healthcare investors in continental Europe and the UK. And getting that stamp of approval of going to the US is great, but be prepared and be careful when you do it.
I think the drive will still be there to go through, seeing, as we've heard several times now, that there is not enough capital around here, or something has to change in that respect.
I would argue that there is always enough capital per se. It's just dependent on what your need is, right? So what I've been hearing over the past day or so from the monitoring what's been going on, it's absolutely true. Capital is very tight right now. But capital is very tight right now for the audience in this room. Earlier startup stage companies, early development companies, even smaller existing companies. I was having a discussion with Carsten and Peter before, there is a definite, what some people would term a risk-off sort of feeling among the investor community right now. I might recharacterize that a little bit as more of a complexity-off environment. When investors become more cautious, they are still investing, but they're investing in what everyone else is investing in. They're taking fewer risks in terms of unproven technologies, in terms of unproven treatments. But if you are a late phase 3 company with good data for a clearly defined market, and it helps as well if it's a clearly defined market that happens to be popular, there's plenty of capital out there, but it's the earlier, more complex stories that are the ones that I think are more difficult, clearly, right now.
You said also you can still go to the US, but you need to be prepared.
Yeah.
And you also said that there is a totally different character of investors there. So what should you prepare, or how should you be prepared? What's the most important part to have prepared?
It's to try and understand those differences and acknowledge that they're there, and then try and understand them. So the two examples I would give, one is on the investor side, one is on the market side. On the investor side, I think that one of the issues that I often discuss, particularly with Nordic healthcare companies, is something to be admired about the Nordics beyond the value and quality looks, beyond the value and quality of your research, of your innovation, is the fact that it is such a collaborative environment. Right? It's something I think the Nordics pride themselves in, and they should. Turning that slightly, you're maybe a little bit too friendly sometimes and a little bit too open. And the way I put it a little more sarcastically to companies that I advise is, if you're going to go to the US for capital, the term be prepared means to realize that those investors are not necessarily your friends. And they are not there to support your endeavor. They're there to support your business. And as long as your interests coincide with that investor, you're fine. But the moment those two things diverge, it's very quickly going to change and very quickly going to get shut down, as opposed to perhaps in Europe, where there's a little bit more flexibility in that regard.
I think you need to be prepared that there's two kinds of investors. Also in US, there's the really short-term investors and there's the long-term investors. So if you're looking for capital in US, of course it's nice to get the long-term, truly long-term investors that will really travel with you and support you with capital when there's milestones being met. But if you talk to investors that have a short-term horizon, and there's a lot of them in US because they are being measured quarter by quarter, not by yearly performance. So they can go in and out of stocks really quick. So what I'm an investor, but I also talk to a lot of companies and tell them, let's say, what should you prepare for? And you need to have a plan, really exact plan to raise capital with milestones ahead. Not just look at the first milestone, because sometimes there can be like 1 year or 1.5 years between the milestones or the data readout. And that's a really, let's say, tough period for some stocks. Because if there's no news flow, stocks can just drift. And it will really be hard to raise more capital at a lower price. And we've seen it so many times that there can be a huge time gap between raising money the first time and the second time. And then the investors, they have just moved on because there's so many opportunities, and investors look in US for really short-term trigger points.
So equity story always on the agenda, and having a continuous news flow. I mean, I would shamelessly say that that's why you work with BioStock. No.
One comment I would make with what Claus just said is short-term versus long-term investors. Absolutely correct. Another way of thinking about that, or to try and identify not specific investors, but kind of characteristics or groups of investors that you should consider, is, I would say, probably be more wary of private equity, because they are typically a little bit more short-term, and by short-term I mean, they typically have a 3-4 year kind of time horizon. I think a potentially untapped area that a lot of companies should think about it. The presentations I've seen over the past couple of days, there are many companies that are very lucky to have good relationships with KOLs, and those KOLs are usually resident in some form of academia in the US, a form of university or research organization or something like that. Almost every one of those, particularly the very largest ones, have both VC and private equity funds associated with them. Your KOL is not necessarily going to know them, but can be an entry point to find who you should be talking to within Duke or within Harvard or Mayo or whatever it is.
And would you advise against those types of private equity too? Or?
No, but be aware of what they are and who they are.
What kind of
be
animal?
Prepared.
Yeah. Okay. So we are always told that the science level is very high in the Nordics. Like you said, that we have a collaborative environment, and everyone feels pretty much, they want to do their best in every way, and quite also capital efficiently, although that could be by necessity, I don't know. But wouldn't this moment in time where valuations are lower and so on, with still high quality in science, wouldn't that be a great time for you as investors to come over here then and pick out a few companies? I think there's too few deals being made.
I think you have to do your homework. I mean, we can always talk about valuations. Maybe they are fair right now. Maybe they're not low. Maybe they were way, way too high 3 years ago. I mean, if you looked at valuations 3-4 years ago and did the reverse DCF and calculated what would be then the sales in $1 billion, some investment brokers in US, they really, let's say, came out and said, be careful right now because the market is super, super hot. It's too high. It's 50% downside. So maybe we are in a fair, let's say, fair situation now that you really need to have good data to get capital. Or let's say, be realistic about what is the value. Also, I think there's always capital available out there, but you also need to be realistic about what is actually the potential valuation. And it's better to get, let's say, the capital so you can actually build your company instead of waiting and say, oh, it used to be that high. No, this is the new normal. This is the new level. Get the financing and then roll the dice. And then, let's say, wait for the readouts.
Valuation is something that occurs at a specific point in time, right? It doesn't occur, as we just heard, it doesn't occur over history. I mean, think about it if you're a homeowner, right? It doesn't matter what your house was worth 6 months ago if you have to sell it today because you need capital, right? So the valuations are something that I think, we have to understand that the market is not a person, right? The market is the ultimate consensus in many ways. I'm being very capitalistic here, but is the ultimate consensus in many ways. And the market hates uncertainty, and it demands certainty. But conversely, the market doesn't provide any certainty. So just because something was valued at X 3 years ago does not mean it's valued at the value of it today is X. And so I think that, you can bring that back into be prepared, which is be aware of that fluctuation in valuations. And if you can, opportunistically take advantage of it when it is in your favor so that you can ride out those periods when it's not. Now, arguably right now is probably in my 35 years the longest period of relatively depressed capital markets activity in healthcare. But, if you have to raise capital now, it's not going to help you to say, hey, 3 years ago you would have paid me X times.
No. It's hard to get it out of your memory, though. Yeah.
Somebody said, price is what you paid, value is what you get.
Yeah.
And you always have to remember this, that, okay, you pay for something, yes, but what is the asset really worth out there in the market, in the jungle? I mean, what is it really worth next time you need more capital?
What are people paying for GLP-1s today versus 5 years ago? Right? It's what's happening right now.
For the record, I think it's fair for a banker to be very capitalistic.
I like to say I'm not a banker, I'm a strategist. So.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely see that as well. Well, I'm going to have to linger on the fact that so many Nordic companies are talking about the US market, and the US market is huge, and there is capital if you have the right preparations and so on. But would you say, to be a little bit harsh maybe, do the Nordic companies have what it takes in general? You said that we were too friendly.
Absolutely, right, is the initial answer. I mean, I've said it a couple of times, I will continue to say it. The quality of innovation, research, development that occurs here is world-class. And there are now, in particular, a number of companies that prove that. I mean, the largest quote-unquote healthcare company in the world for market cap for a while was Novo Nordisk out of Denmark. So there's no doubt about that. Again, I think it comes back to this term that we've used so many times of be prepared. right? I'm not trying at all to discourage anyone from going to the US market, either for capital or as a market. I just, want you to understand, to be prepared for that. But do you absolutely have what it takes? Yes. What I would say, what I've found from personal experience is, in particular, companies that have a very defined and differentiated value proposition seem to do better in the US, because maybe it's a Nordic thing that if you actually have something demonstrably to prove, then you can sort of brag about it a little bit. But if you're competing in a US market and there are a number of other competitors, you've got to go in there hard. And I think that's the part maybe that some Nordic companies often miss. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but again, be prepared and be aware of it.
You want to add something to that, Claus?
No, I think you said it. I mean, already we have said it many times now that preparation is key. So, I mean, it depends on where you are in the clinical phase, if you are early or a little bit late stage, but you need to build relationship in the US. You cannot just, let's say, have Nordic KOLs or European KOLs. If you're really going to have huge success in US, you need to be really strong liaisons with the KOLs and find out how is the market really, let's say, organized also. It's really important to know what channels is there, who can open up these doors. It's really important. So I think you need to be aware that you also need to sometimes pay up. It's expensive to move into the US market. Prices are higher, salaries are much higher than we are used to, and we get a shock, when we see the salaries being paid. But I advise some companies to really look for the right people and also pay up, because that can really speed up the process. If you hire a person that is maybe, let's say, reflection of a European salary, maybe that's a sign that this person is not the right. So look for the qualifications, look for who can really open up the doors. If you get the right person, then you can really have great success.
I think along those lines, one thing that I find perhaps often undervalued from the Nordic perspective is the idea of, strangely enough, the idea of strategic partners. Right? There's a desire in an entrepreneurial community especially. And I'm very open about this. I do what I do for a major organization because I don't have the mindset to be an entrepreneur on my own. I operate well within that system, and so I know my strengths, and so I stick to that. But I think that there's an entrepreneurial mindset that we're going to do this on our own, and we're going to strike our own path. And in many cases, it might even be, we jokingly have a term in the US called BEPSI, big evil pharmaceutical company, right? And so you have to avoid strategic partnerships with these big evil pharmaceutical companies. I think it's just the reality sometimes, right? You're not going to develop a sales and marketing team on your own that is the equivalent of someone who's already active in the space. So there's value with, that I think people are worried that affects their valuation, right? That strategic partners maybe don't pay as much, but I think that there are so many benefits that potentially come from it that it's something that probably needs to be more considered than it often is.
So with just more or less a couple of minutes left, what would be your then final advice to being a US advisor, having a very good overlook of the environment there? What would be your best advice to the Nordic companies sitting here?
I've heard it actually said by a couple of different people in a couple of different ways, but focus, right? Stick to what you know well and do that. And if you especially have a differentiated viewpoint, I don't remember which speaker it was, but openly acknowledge that his company is good at development, but perhaps not so good at commercialization, or it's not something they've historically done. Acknowledge that if that's the case, because you'll be much better off in the long run than trying to build too much at once within the company.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Look out who has been successful in really going to the US market and copy those. It's harder, but you can do it. and maybe it will take time. Maybe you need a 20-year horizon.
Yeah.
I mean,
there are
you cannot
many
just
more.
build a big company overnight.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that focus and think about what is your strength. Maybe you can develop this medical device, but maybe the value is actually to get into a Medtronic, Stryker, Boston Scientific global platform and get a royalty, and then you'll get a lot of value out of that. So I think you just have
with
to
relatively low costs.
Exactly. So you just have to, I think, pick the battle.
Yeah. So basically, find the right friends and realize that they aren't always your friends.
Good.
Very good.
We have to end there. Thank you very much to both of you for taking the time and to sharing your insights and advice. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah. Give them a warm hand.